You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, "Play the news from The Australian."
From The Australian, I'm Claire Harvey, a special bonus episode of The Front for you today. It's the first in a series of episodes we're rolling out over the next 6 weekends as part of The Australian's 60th anniversary celebrations. We've asked a handful of the nation's most eminent thinkers, commentators and experts to reflect on the past 6 decades. Their observations about everything from power and politics to science and identity have been published in a special edition glossy magazine out today. First up is political firebrand, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. The opposition spokesperson for Indigenous Australians was the secret weapon of the No camp during last year's referendum on a voice to Parliament. She felt the proposed advisory body wouldn't be effective in addressing the practical challenges faced by Aboriginal people in rural and remote communities. The voice was resoundingly voted down on October 14, with just over 60% of Australians voting against the constitutional change. Jacinta Nampijinpa Price has written today on the theme of history. She says we need to be honest with ourselves about the good and bad aspects of our national story if we want to move forward together. That's today's episode.
Our Australian story is not perfect. There are shameful chapters, but the arc of our history has been overwhelmingly positive. It's a story that has few historical parallels.
That's Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price reading an excerpt from her essay for The Australian.
The ends don't always justify the means, but honesty is required if we're to move forward and reconcile as a nation.
Her father, David, was a history teacher and a white man. He hails from Newcastle in the New South Wales Hunter, although he has Irish heritage. He married Jacinta's mum, Warlpiri woman and former Northern Territory Minister Bess Nungarai Price, more than 40 years ago. They met in the town of Yuendumu and later relocated to Alice Springs, where they raised Jacinta and her brother Leonard. Jacinta's big brother died of cancer when he was just 10. She was 3 years old at the time. The Prices travelled widely and young Jacinta had been around the world and seen every Australian state before her 13th birthday. But it was growing up on Warlpiri country, her mum's country, as part of a mixed-race family with a history teacher dad, that had a huge impact on how Price thinks about our collective past.
I'm biased because my father was a history teacher, so I had no choice but to appreciate and value what history means.
Jacinta Nampijinpa Price got her start not in politics, but in showbiz. She worked as a singer-songwriter throughout her 20s, releasing her first album in 2013. She describes her sound as a little bit country, a little bit folk, and a little bit soul, and the album was a tribute to her early life in the Territory. Two years later, in 2015, her mum, Bess, officiated Jacinta's swearing in as a councillor on the Alice Springs Town Council, where she served until 2021. She ran in the 2019 federal election, but lost to incumbent Warren Snowden. The next time round, she got up, winning a Senate seat as a member of the Country Liberal Party. And her views on Indigenous issues, domestic violence and colonisation have been ruffling feathers ever since.
The hard fact is that once modernity emerged across the globe, the hunter-gatherer life was not going to last long. There is no alternative possible version of Australian history where Indigenous Australians would have been left alone to continue their way of life. The only question was about colonisation by who and when, rather than if. We're fortunate it was the British who arrived and not many of the other alternatives.
In her essay for The Australian and in her recent political life, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price says we have to talk frankly about the horrors some colonisers inflicted, like the massacres of Aboriginal men, women and children on the frontiers.
We need to understand the atrocities that occurred so that we don't repeat history, but we also need to understand the good that occurred within our history, the way in which we forged a way of life together and created a unique shared Australian culture. I think we need to be able to instill pride within our children, within the generations to come, because if you don't have that sense of pride in who you are and where you come from, then we can't progress forward in a positive way, in a constructive way.
Indigenous leaders have spent decades pushing for treaty, but in the 2010s, this morphed into a vision for something much more specific, a three-phase process beginning with a voice to Parliament, then a Makarrata Commission, and then a treaty with First Nations people. Here's voice proponent and Cobble Cobble woman, Professor Megan Davis.
Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination.
This became Anthony Albanese's first pledge as Prime Minister.
Present and emerging, and on behalf of the Australian Labor Party, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
Makarrata is a Yolngu word that translates loosely to coming together after a struggle. The Makarrata Commission proposed in the Uluru Statement was to focus on truth-telling about Australia's recent history. But as a significant player in the thumping defeat of The Voice, Senator Price isn't a fan of Makarrata either.
I don't think we need truth-telling. I think the concept of truth-telling in the framework of, Indigenous policy, Indigenous Australians, is more driven by this notion that somehow modern non-Indigenous Australians have to compensate for what occurred to Aboriginal people in our country's history. I wouldn't suggest the idea of truth-telling is the way forward, because I feel it's more of a reinvention of history, a rewrite of history, if you like. We need to add to our history, certainly. There's a broader picture that's not being told that needs to complement what we've already been told about our nation's history. And I think that's what needs to be done through the education system, through our historians, but working together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, in that way to fill that gap.
Instead, Jacinta Price backs a different kind of movement.
I think the advancement movement is about taking a positive view of ourselves as a nation, and in order to solve our problems, we need to get on board with one another. No more separatism. How can we push for separatism when, for many of us, our DNA won't allow it? Our family circumstances, our community circumstances doesn't allow for it. It's ludicrous. And so, the advancement movement to me is about treating everybody equally, is about, I guess for me politically also, is serving Australians on the basis of need instead of race. It's about looking forward in practical ways and applying practicality to our everyday lives.
Coming up, what Jacinta Nampijinpa Price says about guilt and responsibility. It's the Australians' 60th birthday on Monday, July 15, and we're diving into our own history. Join our subscribers at theaustralian.com.au, and we'll be back after this break. Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price met her husband, Scottish-Australian singer Colin Lilly, when they were both working in the music business. They married in a traditional ceremony and live in Alice Springs with their blended family. It's a busy household with Jacinta's 3 sons and Colin's 1 all growing up together. At last year's Great Voice debate hosted by The Australian in the run-up to last year's Voice referendum, she described her family's mixed heritage like this.
We've got a blended family. Our boys have got different backgrounds and heritage within them. You know, Mauritian, French, Creole, Malay, Indian, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, German, English. I think there's Chinese, the great-great-grandfather from Mozambique, Warlpiri. They're Australian kids. And ultimately, this is personal for us.
Senator Price sees her own extended family dynamic reflected all around the country.
We've got that shared unity. I grew up in a place like Alice Springs. Everyone was of mixed heritage and, there was intermarrying going on. And that's the case right across Australia. I mean, in the cities, I think somewhere like 80% of those who identify as Indigenous are married to non-Indigenous Australians. So we're mixing it up, We are the Australian story.
She says the idea that modern Australians should bear the responsibility and the guilt for the sins of the past is holding us all back.
I've spoken previously, I've written about the Coniston massacre, which occurred in my family's country, the last sanctioned massacre that occurred in 1928, and the fact that many of my Warlpiri family were murdered as a result of that. But that 75 years after it occurred, we had a commemorative ceremony and invited those descendants of those who killed our family to say to them, look, we don't blame you for what happened in our country's history. We want to recognise these were hard times, but we are now together as Australians moving forward. And I think that was one of the greatest acts of reconciliation that I've ever been a part of. And it was just a natural process for my family. And so I've spoken about history in that context, but I think it was important that day to talk about positive effects, elements of colonisation, modernisation, if you like, because it's rarely ever really highlighted or discussed. It's always within the lens of the horrors, the atrocities, and that everyone now has to compensate for what happened in our nation's history, and talk of reparations and all of those sorts of things. And we've got to move forward from that.
This episode was produced by Kristen Amiot with the support of Bianca Farmarkis. You can read the full essay by Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price in the special edition glossy mag out today or online at theaustralian.com.au.